everybody, and welcome to another of the Raja and Neil's FASD Book Club sessions. Today, we are really privileged to have Professor Raja Mukherjee talking about the transition to adulthood and how to avoid secondary disabilities, or however you want to phrase that. I like to say how to transition for a healthy adulthood. Raja, as you know, is the lead at the National FASD Service and just one of the country's leading lights when it comes to all things FASD. So without further ado, Raja, I'll turn over to you and you can start sharing.
Right. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sandy, for inviting me to do this chapter. So we're working through the different chapters of the book. And just to say that I'm in an away day in a hotel with my ADHD team. So basically, if there may well be people come in and out from behind me, so I can't do much about that, unfortunately. But it was better to do that than cancel because of that. So apologies if you hear noises in the background. So effectively, what I wanted to talk about in this chapter was about thinking about how FASD presents at different points, transition at different stages, and moving through. So there was three broad areas that this talked about in terms of how it all presented, and there's three core parts to it. First of all, changing presentation across the ages. The second of what happens if you miss a diagnosis and the functional deficits and some of the need and how it presents and when, and then timelines of when interventions can take place and how to look at that. And there's some parts around that. Now, some of you who've heard me speak before may well have seen me present on this. Just so if you can see down at the bottom, what you have is the gap between people who are developing in a normal non-FASD fashion compared to those with FASD who have a lower developmental trajectory is narrower. And as people get older and the gap between the two gets further and further apart, what you start to see is that it becomes more and more obvious. And so one of the things about transition and thinking about it is, where do you do the diagnosis? Where do you need to do a reassessment? Where do you need to follow people up with a view to trying to understand what help people need? Just as a couple of examples, if this works. This is some data from the Canadian FASD database. This is not published. This was something that I kindly got off colleagues. The last bar should say 18 plus, but it's somehow that's disappeared. I'm not sure why. But if you just look at the IQ on the top line, which is people with an IQ in the intellectual disability range, what you can see is it starts off about 30% until about 12, where they will have they'll be in the intellectually disabled range. People generally say it's one standard deviation shift of the IQ curves around 25%, so tier 29% is not far off. And what you would see when they get older is, as that gap has got bigger, as we pointed out, you can start to see the numbers go up to it's almost nearly 60% by the time they get to 18 plus, where people are meeting criteria for that presentation. This is a piece of work that I was asked to put together by Jo Buckard, who works now with FASD, National FASD, for a presentation she was giving from data from our clinic, looking at functional ages at different stages across the board. And what you can see on the top line here is the actual age, and this is the age in months, so 72 months is 6 years, 120 for that. And you can see there the months in years, because the way that it pulls out, it gives you an age in terms of your months. And so to compare that, for an average age of 72, there's not a huge amount of difference. Receptive age is probably half that. But in other areas, for example, there's not a huge gap. As you get older, as we said in the other one, for example, for 168, on this individual, you can see there almost half of that in these domestic skills compared to the gap being not so great. But it's not consistent. So this individual who is 18 at 216 months, the gap isn't that great. So it will vary between individuals. So when I say these things as a absolute, they're not absolutes, they are differences. And you can see for this individual who's older, again, there are deficits and gaps between them. So what you can see in terms of the average is for an average of our service of 140, it's different areas have different levels of functional presentation, but the gap becomes more obvious as people are getting older. So you're starting to think, where do we look at this? And how do we assess people at different stages of their presentation? The chapter started to go into more about that understanding of actually there is a changing presentation of individuals as they go through. It's also about thinking about the type of comorbidities that you see with it and transitioning between what can be addressed when they're younger through to what kind of behavioral and other physical problems can perpetuate into different life, and how does that move on. And as we've seen, and this has probably been talked about before, there's a lot of comorbid conditions, 428 in the study that we looked at, across the board, and they vary across from different situations. So conduct disorder, language impairments, intellectual impairments. What's interesting and important is that people who have a conduct disorder in childhood may well go on to have subsequent mental health or other diagnoses. Now, in this situation, if it's identified, firstly, would they get a conduct disorder diagnosis in the first place, or would they be able to manage differently? Again, language disorder here, very high levels, but in that situation, that is something that is more likely to be pervasive, and therefore you need to put in different kinds of intervention as people go through. So understanding what these are can be quite important. And again, some of these other physical health issues will have different levels of impact at different stages. So a surgical issue like a hernia will be repaired, so when they not pituate, where a hearing issue might. And it's trying to understand with all those kind of factors. So again, coming back to the developmental divergence as an idea, that's what we're trying to think about, is at different stages, there are different things that we're going to be recognizing and trying to see how they all fit together with a view to putting in place support at the different aspects. Because what happens if you don't? And this is the negative aspects of what we've understood, is by not identifying people, by not supporting people, by not having the right support as people. Because remember, as we get older, one of the things that happens is society's expectations of us change. We go through a transition into puberty where we start to become sexual beings, and you can see below there around 50% of them will have difficulties with that. The expectations on the individual to have capacity will have a problem where they start to get into issues, potentially trouble with law, because people are not recognizing their problems if we haven't identified that. And 90% in this study went on to have mental health issues. Just one study in a Colorado screening tool for a youth diversion in terms of the offending population that they had there. And what you can see is quite high rates of FASD in those people who are presenting into those scenarios and situations. And what you can see is if it's not recognized, if it's not screened for, then what you will see is a high prevalence of people going through with this and being missed. And so it becomes quite important to try and look at these and put in place enough things, because what we want to try and do is, instead of missing people, we want to change a deficit-based model, i.e. let's focus on what you can't do, to a strength-based model, let's focus on what you can do, and to have better long-term outcomes, to make people more self-aware, being more receptive to getting support, helping better capacity for making connections, developing better perseverance, and improving the hope for the future, and all of these kind of things. So overall improving quality of life. And again, that also with the transition phase has to have something in terms of understanding how people fit. And so there are different things. I'm sorry, this is a bit blurry. This is taken straight from the book as a picture. I couldn't find the original Word document where we had this to take it from. But there's different stages where you can have different factors, where we can look and see what do we need to do at different stages to try and help plan and move these kind of things forward. So in preschool, you need to identify what kind of issues are going to be there. Do we understand any of the kind of problems to pick the right primary school to get the right support? By about the age of 10, it's starting to, again, find out and reevaluate their needs to say, right, there's a communication deficit here, there's other problems. We need to pick the right secondary school, because, again, most secondary schools are going to place more demands on the individual. So a primary school, you have one teacher, you stay in the same room, you tend to be in the same situation. In secondary school, in a mainstream secondary, you're expected to organize yourself, go around, function, and that for some can be too hard. So understanding where to pick. Again, as people get into teenagers, there's growing expectation. And so you need to ensure that that's not missed and plan. I would say about 14 is when I used to start having the conversations with people about what are you going to do when they become adults? Because what you can't do is they suddenly become an adult and you lose the ability to make any decisions for them because the law changes. And so making some plans early enough that you can drip feed this into individuals' psyche will allow you, by the time they get there, to be in a position where it doesn't become a challenge or a difference between individuals. 16, again, they can start to consent for themselves, but do they have capacity in all situations? And making sure before this to try and make sure you've got things in place to try and help. At 18, understand their own needs to reduce their vulnerability. The choices become, it is deemed at 18 that you are capacitous as an adult and that you should be able to make decisions and function in society. That's not always true, and it's not always the case. So it's really important that these kind of things have been looked at to ensure that those kind of things are in place. And after 18, it's continuing to support, continuing to reevaluate to make sure their issues are, so you prevent those secondary disabilities. And we move to that strength-based model of trying to work with people to try and ensure that we get the best outcomes. So 2 broad sets of conclusions from the chapter. First of all, individuals need to identify the difficulties when young to predict how to an individual. It doesn't predict how an individual develop into later life, and that's not clear. So it's important, however, to continue to follow people up. It's clear that evidence would suggest that both physical and mental consideration continue to have an impact longer term on the individual. Where they're supported through childhood and into adolescence, the difficulties need to be built on and strengthen their abilities to improve their outcomes. Move to that strength-based model, not a deficit-based model. It's important that the challenges aren't hidden, but confronted and faced in order to prevent complex situations becoming worse. Again, ignoring something doesn't make it go away. And so having stages in the life where you start to think, what am I going to do at this point in their life? Do I need to tell them everything now, or can I bring it in later? At what point do we need to ensure that they have enough understanding of themselves so they don't get themselves into difficulty because society expects more of them than they can do? To not do so can add to the burden on not just the individual, but their carers and society. And then the financial and societal challenges come with that are important. And good transition planning and engagement with service at different stages can minimize the impact of all of these kind of things. So that's the kind of stuff that we want to try and think about. And the chapter talks about all of those in more detail and goes into explanations. And in 15 minutes, that's a quick overview of all this kind of stuff. So hopefully that gives you a taster of what the chapter did and where to go and some of the things that we talk about within that. The book was supposed to be more practical in terms of trying to guide people what to do rather than be an evidence-based review of everything. So it was kind of give some practical clinical guidance to people as to what to do at different stages, how to look for things to consider. So hopefully that's a starter for 10.
That's fantastic, Roger. Thanks. It's such a concise overview of a really complicated thing that I know affects very many. I was wondering before we stop the recording, though, if you have any thoughts, because I know that you've talked about this before and you've advised National FASD's work on this. How important do you think it is that the individual understands their own diagnosis as they transition into adulthood?
Massively. The thing is, when you go into adulthood, one of the biggest things is the law changes and you are deemed to have capacity and other people cannot decide for you anymore. And it becomes a real challenge for people when their families have been supporting them, helping them decide, and all of a sudden that the law changes and you can't do that anymore. You can assent, you can give part of it, but if they don't want your involvement or they don't choose to, it's important that they have that. And if the more they understand themselves, the more they're willing to accept help, the better the long-term consequences. I think it's best comes from adults with FASD who said that I didn't understand myself before. Now I understand myself and know how to keep myself safe. And that is paraphrasing really, but from people who we know who are adults, I'm not going to mention names, but who have said this many times and have said this in public fora, that it's important for them to understand themselves, because the likelihood is they're going to have to live in the world and they're not going to have you around with them all the time. They need to be able to survive to a certain degree on their own, even if they've got some sorts of support. And the more they understand about their needs and when to ask for support, the better the long-term outcomes.
Okay, great. Before I stop the recording, just to say also to people that there are upcoming sessions. The previous ones are available on YouTube and on the National FASD YouTube channel. And the next sessions coming up, we have on the 23rd of November, conversations about alcohol use and pregnancy with a specialist midwife, Anna Ferguson. On the 8th of December, service delivery organization and models of care that Raja is again going to deliver. And on the 22nd of December, we have Miguel Del Campo from the Department of Pediatrics at UCSD talking about how it's not all about the face. These sessions, there's more than 30 chapters in the book. We've got plans for this series to continue through the year. But now I'll stop the recording and then we'll go into the discussion.